Question 1. What is your definition of a real mediator?
A real mediator, someone who is a mediator, and by the way, and not a quote unquote problem solver. That's the primary alternative language that's used over here in this country, and the sort of dominant paradigm for what it means to be a mediator is you're a problem solver, which means the parties bring a problem to you and you solve it, or you quote unquote help them figure out to solve it. But if they leave without a solution or without a good one, you failed, right? A transformative mediator does not believe that's your job to begin with, or any mediator's job. For a transformative mediator, your job is to support the parties' decision making and decision analysis and decision discussion process, to support them as they work through their issues, examine possible solutions, decide whether or not they want to make those things. So you are a supporter. You are a party supporter. You are not a problem solver for them. You're not doing anything for them. You are supporting them in doing things for themselves. Now, it wouldn't be surprising that lawyers would take the problem-solving view, because that's what they think of themselves. If you read the literature on lawyering, that's like the modern view of what lawyers do. The old view was they fight. That's all. They don't want to solve a problem. They want to win for their client at any cost. If you want to have a reference to a guy who supports that view and has written multiple articles about it, you Google a guy named Robert Condlin, Condlin, who has opposed very virulently, I was going to say viciously, that too, almost every ADR approach, because it's not fighting and lawyers fight. But in the modern view, lawyers solve problems. That's nothing to do with mediation at all. Mediators, in my view, in our view, don't solve problems. They support parties in working through their own problem-solving process, if that's what they want to do. Not all parties want to solve problems. Some parties just want to get together to scream at each other. Some parties want to just get together to tell each other how they feel about each other. Some parties want to get together to change the way they look to and at each other. Nothing to do with solving a problem at all. My job as a mediator is to support their process of interaction, to support party interaction. That's my job. Now, I would be surprised if all mediators in the Netherlands agreed on that, because over here, most mediators would say that's ridiculous. If you're going to do that without producing a settlement, you're not a mediator, and you're not going to be in business very long either.
And you fail. Huh? Then they say you
failed. Yes, if you didn't get a settlement, you failed. So, but the answer to your question is, that's what I think the job of a mediator is: supporting party conflict interaction. And with that kind of support, the parties themselves will almost inevitably shift and move from a negative and destructive interaction to a positive and constructive one. And they will also almost automatically, inevitably, reach solutions to the problems that matter to them on terms that matter to them. And when they don't, they will be able to say, okay, we don't agree, fine, but we're still human beings. We can still relate to each other. These days, anyway, living where I live, that's more and more important. I can tell you it's going to be, I don't know how long, but for sure more than the next 4 years, maybe the next 8, maybe the next 12, before left and right in the United States can even sit down and talk to each other, much less relate to each other. Helping that to happen would be an enormous contribution. Mediators can do it.
Question 2. Everyone is influenced by biases and views. This can hinder them in their interactions. As a mediator, I can observe what hinders them. Can it be helpful for a transformative mediator to support parties by giving them insight in what hinders them?
I certainly agree with you. It would be impossible not to agree that that everybody is influenced by these things you describe. And everyone is coming into the room with these, parameters that make it hard for them to get out of their box, recover their sense of self and other, positive sense of self and other, and that I can see some of that stuff and they can't. So I would say a couple of things about that. First of all, I would always be very, very careful about trusting what I think I see from my seat outside their world. We have to recall that we see these people for like a snapshot, a little instant, unless you're dealing with people in, let's say, a family mediation over a course of years, which I know happens. But generally speaking, that's not what happens. We see them over a short time frame, and we see them from outside. I don't think that's a very good basis for diagnostic interventions. Transformative mediators basically, where we step over the line is diagnosis. Diagnosis is part of problem solving. It's not part of supporting interaction, interactional support, I call it. Interactional support doesn't require me to understand the problem, and certainly not to diagnose it. It requires me to pay very close attention to what the parties are saying and to help them say what they want to say, and maybe to say it better by helping them. Now, that itself, this goes to a second part of my point. If they are in fact, we're seeing an interaction that the parties are having. If I simply help them to speak more clearly and articulate more clearly what they want to say, the likelihood is that they will see these things for themselves that you are worried that they are not seeing. And in addition, remember, they're in a room with somebody else. And in that room, the other person also has a part in the conversation. And you also have, as a mediator, the obligation and the ability to support what that person is saying. So if I employ, and this is again what I mean by the entire model of practice in transformative mediation supports party determination. The fundamental intervention of a transformative mediator we call reflection. So when I reflect what you say to you, Tron, you are hearing yourself. You are hearing what you are saying. And most of the time when people say things, they do not hear what they are saying. It's very hard to listen to yourself at the same time you're talking. And therefore you don't hear what comes out of your mouth. And when you do hear it, you're often shocked by it. A very common thing when people have a conflict, let's say domestically, is, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Play back a recording and you'll find out you did say that. And not only that, you said it in a not very nice tone of voice too. But you don't hear any of that, right? When a mediator reflects to someone, they actually begin to relate to their own voice, to their own vision, to their own prejudices. They have to confront, they don't have to, they're automatically confronting themselves, facing themselves. And when they are, oftentimes, if not always, they don't 100% like what they see. And when they don't, that's the strongest motivation to change, much stronger than anything you could possibly say to them. And by the way, it's also much more accurate. It is a real reflection of what they're saying. It's not your diagnosis. If you want to put it this way, it's their self-diagnosis, right?
I understand.
And when you remember, there's this other person, right, who's going to respond to what they said. And probably part of the stuff that the other person is going to say is, you don't understand me at all. You're just reacting to me like a such and such, right? They're going to say something about the original speaker's prejudices, basically. And you're going to reflect that too. And when you reflect that, that's also going to be heard by the first party. And it's going to be heard much better than it would ever be heard by the counterpart, him or herself. Mm-hmm. Because not only do we not listen to ourselves when we talk to each other, we surely don't listen to each other. Reflection allows parties to listen both to themselves and to each other in a much fuller and deeper way than if you were not there doing that role. Doing that, Tron, you said, what can you do? That's what you can do, in my opinion. That's what you can do. And it doesn't have any of the downsides of diagnosis and of imposing your view of who they are on who they actually are. You're simply reflecting what they are saying about who they are and about who each other is. That's what you can do.
Question 3. Do you usually work with both parties present? Or do you also work with parties separate? And can you say something about your personal ethics in mediation, for instance on the subject of confidentiality?
I'm going to work with parties in whatever way they want me to. So if the question is, do you work with them together or apart? That's part of the process. They control the process, not just the outcome. There is a sort of a saying in the mediation literature that mediators say, I control the process, you control the outcome. For us, that's completely untrue. You control the process, you control the outcome. So my first question to people is, how do you want to do this? If they want to meet separately, that's fine. I can do that. If they want to meet separately before we meet together, if they want to have separate like orientation sessions, that's fine too. Whatever they want. If they disagree about how to do it, then the question is, would you like to talk about, since you disagree about this, do you want to talk about that? Because that's obviously the thing that's on the table. And then I try to support their conflict about how to have their discussion. So I'm always guided by what they want to do. In the some of us are old enough to remember the Paris peace talks after the Vietnam War. And in the Paris peace talks, everybody was complaining that it took them, I don't know what it was, 4 months, 5 months to decide on the shape of the table. Like, that's a terrible thing. It wasn't a terrible thing. That's what they needed to talk about. And they did. And when they finally got a table in the right shape, that was tremendous progress. So same thing here. So in general, I recommend you to sort of Google some of the stuff I've written. I've written a fair amount about mediator ethics from the transformative mediation point of view, including an article a couple of years back, or maybe only a year or so ago, about what transformative mediator ethics would look like. I think that was called something like a pluralistic approach to mediation ethics. More specifically in relation to your question, and this is, I think, a useful thing to say, when I come into the process, I have to be honest in saying to people, look, you have total control of this process. There are certain things that I have as my principles that I have to tell you in advance, because you can ask, I'm going to do whatever you want, except one exception is I'm not going to offer you substantive advice, even if you ask me. And I have to try to explain to them why that's true. I have to give them a reason. A, I'm not a very good substantive expert. B, if I do that, and if I start to do that, I'm going to wind up having to do that on an ongoing basis. And that makes it impossible for me to do other stuff with you and for you that I think is more important. So if you ask me those questions, I will have to politely decline to offer an opinion. That's number one. Number two, I will not share any of the information that you give me with anyone else unless you ask me or permit me to do so, period. And the same thing, I have to give people a reason for that. Usually mediators have these, boilerplate opening statements that say, I operate on the basis of confidentiality. Why? Why do you do that? No one ever explains these things to the parties that you're dealing with. And therefore, in a certain sense, you have a kind of control over the situation. You're the expert and they're the go-alongs. So I have to explain why I am going to operate on this basis of confidentiality. And again, I can do that in empowerment and recognition terms. The reason I'm going to do that is so that nobody else is going to come in here and mess around with your decision-making power. And that you yourselves are not going to be, I'm not going to make it so that you can't trust what you can't talk. You can't say things to me. If you can't say things to me, going back to what I just said before to Antoine, then you can't find out more about what you think by speaking to me and allowing me to reflect to you. You're not going to be able to do that. It's almost like talking to a therapist, right? If a therapist shares his information with the outside world, nobody's going to therapists anymore. So therefore, that's why these are my principles. And I can say that. I have not only a right, an obligation to say that to people.
Question 4. When participants decide they want to talk to you separately, then how can you support the interaction in a conversation them being in different rooms?
If they're in separate rooms, I can still, with each one separately, almost like if you were a lawyer or a therapist interviewing a client or
Yep.
having a session with a client, I can still listen, allow them to talk, listen to what they're saying, reflect what they're saying, see what different pieces of their situation they're talking about. I'm describing reflection and summary. I can do all of that with people, each one in a separate room. And as I do that, my premise is, my assumption is, as I do that with a person, they're going to become stronger. They're going to become more confident. And they're going to become more eager to engage directly with the other person. At which point they're going to decide, you know what? I think I'd like to actually be talking with the other person here. And if I've done it with both people, they're likely to both feel that, and they're likely to want to come together. Now, when they do, they're likely to backslide, because once they see each other and they have to hear each other, they're going to probably sort of degenerate somewhat. Fine. But the decision on whether and when to come together is theirs. So that's a short answer.
Question 5. TM is not about reaching a solution. However, are there any statistics on how often parties reach a solution or settlement? Does the increase of empowerment and recognition stimulate parties to reach settlement?
The answer to this question, like almost all other questions involving metrics, is that we don't have them. At least we don't have good, solid metrics. The best are probably from the US Postal Service mediation program. And those results have been summarized in several places, including in two chapters actually, in our Transformative Mediation source book. One written by the woman who conducted most of that research, Lisa Bingham, and the other by one of our dear colleagues who summarized it, Dorothy Delanoce. Two separate chapters in that book talk about the metrics from the Postal Service and compare them to some extent with metrics from other mediation programs. But that's a very limited sample. If I were to say on the basis of that sample, I would say that the metric is that transformative mediations settle in somewhere between 70 and 85% of cases. Whereas the statistics from standard conventional court-sponsored mediation, for example, is that settlements are achieved in 95% or more of cases, which is exactly what I would expect. Because in court-ordered mediation, mediators are not supporting party conversation. They are generating settlements intentionally, forcefully, and sometimes forcibly. So you would expect a much higher rate of settlement. The statistics, however, suggest to me that transformative mediation does indeed do what you're saying, meaning it facilitates parties reaching settlements when they decide that's the right thing to do. And in a significant minority of cases, people reach the conclusion that this is not a case that I want to settle. I want to do something else. I want to keep fighting. I want to go to court. I want to just live with some sort of ambiguous situation, whatever it is. But to the extent we have statistics, they do bear out what you say. And what we think, which is that this process will help people make decisions. And most of the time, when they get clear about what they want to do, it will not be difficult for them to figure out how to do it by making transactional adjustments.
Question 6. What is your personal drive regarding to the transformative approach?
I have a very strong belief, and these beliefs are expressed in our work, especially our book, Promise of Mediation. I have some very strong beliefs about my fellow human beings and myself. Beliefs, I believe, and I have beliefs about beliefs. I believe that our beliefs, our principles, our premises lie at the very bottom of who we think we are as human beings, and therefore what we ought to do with the limited time we have in this life. And my beliefs are that human beings, in their very essence, in the very essence of their humanity, are strong in themselves, capable, have enormous capacity for governing their own lives. And at the same time, they are very strong in their desire and capacity to connect with their fellow human beings. Call those assumptions the belief in the strength and compassion of every human being. Whenever human beings are deprived of that sense of their own strength and their own ability to connect with their fellow human beings, they are miserable. It's almost like being imprisoned. In fact, there's strong analogies between those negative states and, in fact, prisons and prison camps and prisoners. So my belief in those qualities of, you could call it human nature or humanity, human identity. Human identity is a combination of strength of self and connection with other. Without either of those things, a human being is not fully human. And that's what I believe. I believe that any social institution, all social institutions that diminish and denigrate either of those sides of our core human identity are inimical, are inhumane, and need to be changed in order for us to achieve our humanity as individuals and a humane society as a whole. So for me, this work on transformative mediation is a means of working with a process that supports those fundamental elements of human identity and doesn't frustrate and deny and denigrate them. And most of our social institutions, unfortunately, do frustrate, denigrate, and deny our human identity, our humanness. So we're forced into inhumanity by the institutions that we have allowed to be constructed around us. Now you can complain and moan about that as much as you want to, and blame it on folks at the top who certainly bear their share of responsibility. But in the final analysis, you got to do what you can do to change it, in my view. So I've never not felt the drive to change those things, because to stop driving for it would be to accept, okay, I'm going to settle for living in an inhumane world, inhuman and inhumane. As long as I'm alive, I'm not settling for that. As long as I have, some energy, I have to keep working to change that. And my vehicle for working on it, there are other vehicles. There certainly are other vehicles. By the way, what I've discovered over the years is that there are people in almost every field who share these beliefs and these drives, as strange as that may seem. There are lawyers who think this way, although most lawyers don't. There are therapists that think this way, although most therapists don't. There are architects, there are doctors, there are nurses. There are people in almost every field where they relate to others who believe in supporting positive human capacity rather than telling people what to do because they're too dumb and selfish to figure it out for themselves. So, this is my thing. If I were focused on lawyering skills, and I teach that to some extent, and I use the same approach in teaching it to my law students. If I were in medical schools, and I'm about to give a course to medical students at Hofstra next year. If I were teaching architects, if I were teaching business managers, same stuff. Help them to find their way back into their humanity. I don't know how many of you have felt this working with parties as a mediator. In my work with parties, and even with students role-playing mediations, what always has struck me this is in part in relation to your comment about a humble role. What has always struck me is the absolutely heroic quality of parties in conflict interaction. I see parties overcoming their own weakness and their own self-centeredness in these mediation sessions. And I sit back in awe of it. I think, my God, could I do that? Do I ever do that in my life in conflict? And to me, this is what we do. We support, when I say we support parties in claiming their humanity, it is heroic in this world and in this life that we live in to claim your humanity. There's so many things allied against it that when people stand up, as we say, step up to the plate and claim their strength and their compassion for one another, you have to say, oh, that's a miracle. That's heroic. And that's, I think, also what motivates me, Miriam. I think my fellow human beings are heroes.
Question 7. Did you ever experience any doubt about the core values of the transformative model during a mediation? And how can I make my confidence in the transformative approach grow?
One way I could answer it is this. We see what we look for. We see what we look for. This is a sort of fundamental principle of, postmodernist thought, right? There's a lot of ways to see the world, and you can find evidence for almost anything you want to make anything, but you have choices about that. So when I walk into a room with people who are going to be my clients, what am I looking for? Am I looking for their deficits, or am I looking for their assets? Am I looking for their shortcomings, how they're not really up to the situation, or am I looking and expecting to find their strengths? I also teach this to my students because lawyers are deeply infected with a deficit view of their clients. When they walk into the office, they expect to find a bumbling idiot. And not only that, a selfish bumbling idiot. And therefore, that's what they find. So what I guess I have tried to do over the years is, as a way of putting these beliefs into practice, is to sort of I'm just thinking, and I do the same thing as a teacher. That's my real challenge, to do it as a teacher, to anticipate, to say to myself, I'm moving into this room with these two people who are potentially, at least, both strong and compassionate, whatever they may be situationally thrown out of. That's not who they really are. This is who they really are. So I'm sort of waiting to see it. It's like a movie where you're waiting for the climax where somebody really rises to the occasion, right? You're not expecting somebody to be the same goof that they were at the beginning all the way at the end. Film directors structure that intentionally, but the truth of the matter is it happens in front of our eyes. So maybe what I'm saying to you is learn to look for the positive. If you look for it, you'll see it. You see what you look for. You find what you look for. That's a sort of an existential philosophy created by looking for it. Not easy. I didn't say it was easy.
Well, that's
There
disappointing.
is this skeptical, cynical voice that comes up and says, get out of here. That's not who these people are. You got to be kidding. I just want to share this with you because it's a recent thing for me. Recently, a long time ago, I read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, long time ago. For some reason, recently, when I was writing a recent article about party strength, agency, I reread it. And I was stunned to read some of the things he says there. on the basis of living through the worst of the concentration camps. And what he says is that the people who had these strong beliefs in their own capacity and in their connection with others around them, they survived. Almost uniquely, they survived. And then I read another book, which is much less well known, by a woman named Leah Kaufman, about a different Holocaust, a Holocaust that occurred. It wasn't different, it was the same thing, but in a different place that most people have never heard about, a place called Transnistria, which is a portion of Romania off on the other side of the Dniester River, where millions of Jews were killed by a combination of Romanian and German Nazis. And she survived as a 9-year-old child, having witnessed the death of everyone in her family, and then going through multiple concentration camps and multiple other terrible tests. And the whole way, she survived because of this positive orientation. And she became, she has become a worldwide speaker. She's now in her 90s. I don't know how much speaking she's doing anymore. But again, these two things had such an impact on me. This is not a kind of, pie in the sky, idealized, unrealistic picture of human nature. It's optimistic. Yeah, what's the alternative? I'm not going to be an optimist. And if not, then I'm going to be a pessimist. And existentially speaking, that's going to determine the outcome. That's going to construct the world in a completely negative way. So what you want is what you get. I don't want the negative.
Question 8. Can you elaborate on the term moral growth in relation to the transformative framework?
Okay.
In our first book, we used specifically the term moral growth as the value underlying transformative mediation. In our second book, and most of our subsequent writings, we did not use that term, right? And lots of people have asked, why not? What was wrong with that? So the answer to that is, as far as using the language, it obviously hit a nerve, a negative nerve, for lots and lots of people, based upon assumptions about what we meant, because the word moral, at least in the United States, is connected with right-wing, moral majority, 10 Commandments, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing wrong with the 10 Commandments in my book, but anyway, for a lot of people, that was very, very controversial and off-putting language, so off-putting that they missed the point, which we made pretty explicitly in that book, that, and there's a lot of literature on this, that the moral dimension, and I was led to that word by a developmental psychologist named Carol Gilligan, whose work focuses on human moral development. And it's part of a whole stream of work in the psychology field on adult moral development in adolescence, in children, at all stages of life. What do they mean by moral development? So in that literature, the word moral means the encounter between self and other. That's the moral realm, the realm in which self and other meet. And what do you do? How do you behave in that realm? How you behave in that realm is a matter of human morality, which is what we meant. Moral growth in that realm means that, and again, the two dimensions are self and other. Moral growth in that realm means that you become more able to give due consideration and regard to both self and other in a balanced way, which is why some people call that, and we did, a relational framework, relating and balancing the claims of self and other, and not giving short shrift to either one. So mature human morality in that framework is a person who never thinks only about self or only about other, but always thinks about both and struggles to balance the claims of both, which may come out in different ways in different situations for different people. But that's what characterizes human moral maturity. So in other words, it is the combination of consideration for self and consideration for other. Now, for us, that perfectly reflected the transformative framework, in which positive conflict requires a regard for both self, strength of self, and recognition and understanding of other, without determining how it comes out in any particular context. So I wanted to mention that because the word moral, we used it we thought people would understand that word. Oh no, they did not. And therefore we stopped using that word, and we were much more specific about balancing the claims of self and other, which is what it means. Now, talking about where do I see examples of that? I don't know. I think I would see an example of that in almost every mediation that I've ever seen, because that's what people do. That's what people do. To put it more in the context of my daily work and to talk about myself, okay? So I'm a teacher. I teach in a law school. I have to challenge my students when they are not thinking deeply enough about whatever it is that's in front of us at the time. And I have to wake them up, if you will, to think about it. But at the same time, I have to realize that whenever I challenge them, and I'm teaching a class of 50 people, sometimes 100, I'm challenging a 20-something in the presence of 40 or 90 other 20-somethings, which is a very possibly hurtful thing to do. So I have to work all the time at balancing my sense of obligation to open their minds and get them to think clearly with my respect for their tenderness. I mean, they're barely past adolescence, and they're easily embarrassed. And the tendency of a law professor in particular, because this is a tradition in law teaching in this country, is to be very sharp. And I'm all the time trying to shut my mouth, open it just enough to challenge them, but not enough to hurt them. I would describe that as a moral conflict that I'm always trying to struggle with in my own work. In relating to people in organizations. So I have an institute that I founded 20 years ago, of which Anya is currently the president. And as we go through the years, and I've sort of become emeritus in my role in this institute, of which I used to be president, I still have a lot of strong opinions about how things should be as it moves into the future. But we also have I have a lot of new colleagues, younger colleagues who are going to in fact carry this institute into the future, who also have a lot of strong opinions. And so I struggle with, again, a similar, how much do I open my mouth and say my piece, and how much do I keep my mouth closed and let other people have more say? Because, first of all, it's the right thing to do, but that's a struggle for me. People would say, well, that's a moral struggle? You bet your sweet life it is, because it's a struggle to balance the claims of self and others.
I think we can talk for ages about transformative mediation, and it's lovely to hear you and explain things to us and listen to our questions. So thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and not just to speak to you, but to be with you. And it's really a wonderful thing for me, having invested these years of my life in this, to see so many people interested and knowledgeable and um, and trying to find a way to apply these principles in their own life and work. Thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you for watching or listening to this webinar. We hope you found it interesting. If you would like more information about the model, or if you're interested in one of our trainings, please feel free to contact us.